Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, talking all things movement, whole food nutrition and environmental wellness with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, my name is Ben Adelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to Season 2, Episode 10. Now, a quick reminder, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please do leave us a review as it helps our ranking. And do share these conversations with other people. We all need to learn and make better informed decisions about our personal health as well as the planet's. Now, on that note, Emma, who are we chatting to on this episode?
Okay, so today we are incredibly fortunate to welcome Professor Corey Bradshaw to the show. Corey is the Matthew Flinders Professor of Global Ecology at Flinders University and is the Chief Investigator and Models Theme Leader at the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. Corey has published over 300 scientific papers, one in particular we plan to unpack in today's discussion. Also to his name are 3 books, multiple book chapters, and a string of scientific awards and accolades. His blog, Conservation Bites, is a fantastic resource for anyone interested in planetary health, and it's extremely popular, having been visited over 2.3 million times. Professor Bradshaw, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, Corey, let's start a little bit about yourself. You started off with a BSc, went on to do a postgrad certificate in veterinary conservation medicine, and ended up with a doctorate at our very own here in New Zealand at Otago University. So quite the journey. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into all of this?
Yes, well, I was born. No, I won't go down that line. But it actually is relevant because I'm originally from Canada. I grew up in the bush in the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. And my father was a trapper, a fur trapper and a hunter. And I had a very close relationship with the bush, but more in a consumptive sense. So, the first time I saw a city, I was 16 years old. We were really...
Wow.
We had, in a lot of ways, we had a very indigenous lifestyle. But that kind of, I guess, seeded the appreciation for natural systems. And because I was constantly in the bush and seeing pretty amazing things, I guess I got the installation of a conservation ethic, even though for probably the wrong reasons when I was a kid. Interestingly, in Canada, I don't know if it's the same thing today, but back in the day, the trappers were actually the biggest voice against deforestation because, as soon as they logged an area, there were no more animals to trap. So, they were very vocal and very effective at stopping a lot of the logging. I hope that's still the case today. But, sometimes we don't necessarily think about the ends and how we get there. We often lose ourselves in the process. But anyway, that's just my beginnings. I end up coming to, your introduction was a little bit back to front. I did a master's after my undergraduate in northern Canada and worked on caribou and their effects, the effects of the petroleum industry on their movements and behavior. So the seismic testing, that sort of thing. Then I came to New Zealand, to lovely Dunedin and Otago, and I did my PhD there. And that was really an eye opener because I think that was although I traveled quite a bit outside of Canada, that was the first time I'd lived outside, and I decided that the Southern Hemisphere was for me. Went down to Antarctica a few times in my days in New Zealand. That was brilliant. And again, that just sort of blew my mind. Then ended up in Tasmania and did a postdoc there and spent a lot of time down on Macquarie Island, for example, in the subantarctic, more Antarctic stuff. And then I had a massive switch and ended up in Darwin, where I was focusing on tropical systems, so working on everything from turtles to crocodiles to feral buffalo and bunting, and did all sorts of forest recovery, fire stuff, and it was quite a very northern Australian, hanging out of the back of a ute, putting big needles into bantang to put collars on them, and catching crocodiles and kakadu, and that it was very yeah, very Dundee in a lot of ways. And during that time is when I ended up doing mostly remotely the veterinary conservation medicine stuff, because I had a strong background in capturing animals for scientific purposes, but I didn't really have the vet side of things. I didn't become a vet. It was just more learning some more in-depth animal health and a lot to do with chemical immobilization. These days, I mean, after I did that, I ended up in Adelaide, first at the University of Adelaide and at Flinders now for the last 4 years. And I really moved away from the field side of things. And I'm mostly a mathematician these days, for want of a better descriptor, because most of what we do, of course, is numbers. And I always tell my students this, science is measurement. Measurement produces numbers. The discipline that deals with numbers is mathematics. So essentially, I'm a mathematician. I'm a desktop warrior these days. And that's pretty much up to today. Yeah.
What a colourful path that you've led there. How did you, just a quick side note, how did you cope with the heat in Darwin after being in so many cold areas?
Yeah, well, up until I left Hobart. Hobart was the warmest place I'd ever lived. And yeah, it was a bit of a transition. And yeah, I remember when we were down for a couple of years, we'd go to, visit places like Townsville and say, wow, it's cool here. I have to say I didn't enjoy the weather. I mean, maybe those 2 months in June and July during the dry, but the buildup was pretty awful. And hats off to Darwinians who can handle that in stride, because, yeah, I found it difficult. Adelaide's hot in the summer, but it's at least it's not as humid.
Now, you have published 3 books. One of them, Killing the Koala and Poisoning the Prairie, it's discussing the similarities between Australia and America, kind of both being on a crash course towards environmental destruction, basically. And it seems to me like it was a little bit of a primer to the paper that we'll unpack in greater detail today. But could you just briefly tell us a little bit about that book before we dive into anything else?
Sure. Well, to introduce that book properly, I have to sort of introduce my co-author, Paul Ehrlich, who is famous for many other reasons. Paul and I met probably 15 years ago now, when I was visiting Stanford University, and we just got on like a house on fire and decided that we needed to start. I mean, Paul is a veteran of amazing books, going right back to his first one, and The Population Bomb, which is still discussed these days. I think it was published first in the late 60s. And he's definitely a household name in terms of conservation. He's published over 900 papers, and he's a stalwart of conservation, but dealt with lots of other things that most biologists, at least, don't get into. For example, the societal, socio-political, ethical side of life, and how it affects conservation. And I think that really started me on the path towards looking at beyond my specific discipline. I mean, in a lot of ways, if you're looking just at the conservation biology side of things, we pretty much know the score. We know what to do. We know what affects species, and we know what makes ecosystems degrade. So the solutions are pretty much socioeconomic ones and behavioral psychological ones these days. It's not, the science, just like climate science, it's pretty much a done and dusted. It's how we deal with it, how we change things. So I kind of delved more into the sociopolitical side of things, for which I have absolutely zero expertise in terms of actual formal education. So over the years, I've been becoming more of a polymath in that respect. And of course, aligning myself with actual experts. I think one of my abilities is to string together very disparate fields to some sort of communal understanding and a cross-fostering of language, and trying to get rid of some of the jargon, because that tends to alienate people. And Paul really put me on that path. So that book was, being Australian, well, now I've been in Australia longer than I've been anywhere else in my life. And Paul being an American, we noted that there were a lot of similarities in the pathways, even though the origins were completely different. And it was a bit of an allegory for most other nations on the planet, really. You could have written that book about any two nations and comparing them, but because of our particular expertise, we wanted to give people on both sides of the fence, if you will, an appreciation for it doesn't really matter where you start, it's where you're going that counts.
And your latest book, The Effective Scientist, which talks about the approach to improving the scientist's career, I feel like that is that taking a little bit of a dig at some of the community?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, anyone who's even vaguely familiar with academia realizes that there's a lot of, I hate to use the word game, but, you know, it is a process, and there are cultures and there are expectations, and not all of it is just. And, you know, we have gender imbalances, and we have racial issues, and we have, you know, sexual orientation difficulties, and we have money versus education, and all those competing and conflicting issues. And so you have to be able to survive in that system. And when you're a student, you're not necessarily up to speed with all of those kinds of competing drives and requirements. And so the book was basically, I wrote the book as if I were an up-and-coming student and really didn't know the landscape. And I wish, and I said this in the book, I wish I'd had this book when I was starting out. So it's kind of like how to survive in academia. In some ways, some of the aspects I'm saying that you need to survive and need to change, and especially things like the pressure on academics to do a billion different things, and, you know, I'll still get paid 9 to 5. And, you know, I mean, in a lot of ways it applies across careers, but it was very specific to, you know, surviving academia. That said, most of the students these days that go through even PhDs probably don't end up in academia. There just aren't that many positions. So it's helping you to survive a system that really isn't conducive to keeping you there.
Fair enough. So let's get into it. We're here to talk about a paper that was published earlier this year, 13th of January. You were the lead author. It cites more than 150 studies, and it's titled Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future. Now, we always make a point on our podcast that, you know, sometimes our conversations do end up being a bit of doom and gloom, and we always want to end off on a positive, but we're really starting off with quite the aptly titled paper here, Avoiding a Ghastly Future. Do you want to introduce us to the paper, big picture? What was that all about?
Yeah, I guess if you're familiar with any aspect of what you might loosely bunch together as sustainability, and that includes everything from, you know, the trajectory of different species, climate change trends, political movements, refugees, the distribution of food, energy, what have you. If you're a specialist in any of those areas, there's not a lot of good news. I mean, we have little wins here and there, but then something comes along like the 2019-2020 bushfires, and, you know, the biggest fires ever experienced in Australian history, and millions, if not billions, of individuals disappearing right away. You know, 3/4 of Kangaroo Island burning down. It gets to the point where wherever you look, everything's on the down, and people offer solutions, and they because of the siloing, especially in academia, particular specialization. I know you guys are specialists in diet and food and health. Then there's other people who are specialists in energy provision, and there are specialists in, you know, human health, and there are specialists in the trajectory of different species, biology, conservation biology. But when you kind of put them all together, those solutions tend to break down. And a really great example of why they break down is the lack of connectivity. And that is in the UN's Sustainability Development Goals. Now, the UN's Sustainability Development Goals, I think there's about 18 of them. I haven't read all of them in great detail, but the ones that I'm most familiar with, you know, we're talking about alleviating hunger and poverty, dealing with climate change, making sure that no species go extinct, so on and so forth. If you look at them individually, they're very laudable goals. Most of them are failing, but they're still laudable goals. But when you try to put them all together, you see that the success in one, for example, alleviating poverty, which is a good thing in its own right, ends up destroying ecosystems and then completely averting the pathway of another SDG. That means that this web that we live in, the society that we live in, and that's including the natural environment, are so interconnected and complex that basically a small solution here doesn't really get to the heart of the problem. And the problems are massive. And that's this cascading effect of, we do one little thing here, and we ignore all these other components. For example, it's kind of an anathema to anyone in the sort of environmental green space to talk about nuclear energy. Yet, nuclear energy is one of those big ticket potential solutions to a lot of the climate issue. Now, that's a very emotive and historically difficult conversation to have, but it's the kind of conversations that we need to have. So this paper really put together, I guess, as much of the existing evidence about where the pathways of different elements of society are going and how they're interconnected. And it paints a very, very gloomy picture. A good example of that, of course, is that you say, okay, well, climate's getting worse, species are going down the toilet, and natural systems are really suffering. And as we said in the paper, we have all the information, we have the data, it's very well established. These are hard facts. We should be more and more socio-politically capable of dealing with it, but it's the opposite that's happening. The opposite is that we're becoming more entrenched in ideologies. We're getting more populism invading our politics, and we are becoming basically a little bit more protective of the fewer remaining resources. And this is tied up in wealth distribution, but it's also, xenophobia. As people clamor for the remaining resources, and there are, honestly, per capita, there are fewer and fewer because, for one, we've tended to dig up or expand our resource extraction to the point where we've tapped into most natural systems in the world already. We have greater and greater wealth disparity, and the prospect, for example, of refugees coming in to a particular country to escape some of the horrors of their life, that whether that be warfare or famine or drought or climate disaster, means that people get this very protective. These are people I don't know coming into my patch, potentially taking my stuff. Of course, these are all perceptions. Most of this stuff isn't actually based in any reality, and so you get fear. And fear promotes populism and extreme ideologies. And ironically, you become less politically capable of dealing with major global issues because of this entrenched populist ideology. So we're kind of in this toilet spiral of reduced system resilience and reduced capacity to deal with that, which produces more loss of resilience, which produces even weaker governance structures. And so we kind of get into this vortex, this toilet spiral. And that's what concerns us as academics. And I'm not just saying scientists here, because I'm working with a lot of social scientists, that we without looking at the bigger picture, all of our good advice is going to go unnoticed at the very least. It's going to be actively destroyed at the very worst. So we are seen more as a political movement as opposed to a survival movement. It's another point we make in the paper that, environmentalism in a lot of ways has been weaponized, and it's seen from the far right, at least, as a far left endeavor, but it affects everyone equally. I like to use the example of the libertarian. Now, if you take the purest form of libertarianism, it's basically, leave me alone, let me do my own thing, bugger government, don't get in my way, this is my patch, my stuff. It's very selfish, let's face it, but that's the ideal libertarian. The ideal libertarian should be the greatest environmental warrior on the planet, because everything that happens on the planet affects that person who believes that they don't want any other influence from anyone else. They should be strongly against, say, for example, their neighbor poisoning the water source above their property because it flows through theirs, the air they breathe, the danger of fire coming in and wiping out their property, their house. But it's the opposite. The libertarians tend to be the most vehemently opposed to any environmental regulation because it is wrapped up with the extreme opposite of their political ideal. So it's not a rational component. And there are many scientists that sort of get very frustrated with the fact that, good advice is being offered. We've got the evidence to fix X, Y, and Z, and yet it is ignored because we fail to realize that has to be cast within a psychological or human behavioral context that affects both economy and politics. So, this is why getting out of my comfort zone was essential for me to be able to say, look, I've done my job on the science front, but I haven't really made a difference. And I'm hoping that this kind of endeavor will start to shake people's tree enough that they start to think, whoa, okay, this is actually a lot worse than we thought. And we need to deal with the broader picture and all of the non-scientific elements that affect what we're studying.
That's a fantastic overview of the really in-depth paper and the topics you've covered. For people that haven't read the article yet, and we will link it in our show notes, let's just unpack it a little bit with some of those just mind-blowing stats that you've got in there. So the paper's discussing the 3 major environmental issues that have received little attention but really do require urgent action, as you've outlined. Let's start with the biodiversity loss. So what's happened in regards to our biomass of terrestrial vegetation and biodiversity in the last 11,000 years since agriculture started?
Yeah, well, I won't go into every single thing that we
wrote
there, but I'll just, since the start of agriculture, going back 11,000-ish years, biomass of all terrestrial vegetation, so that's all the plant life on land, has declined by about half. So we've lost about half of our global vegetation, which means that all the biodiversity, all the species that are attached to that, we've lost probably more than a fifth of the biodiversity so far. Now, we've only recorded 700 animal extinctions and about 600 plant extinctions over the past 500 years, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because as species decline towards extinction, they become harder and harder to census. The fact is that we've only probably got a really good idea of the distribution and abundance of maybe 1% of the species on the planet. It means that a lot of these species go extinct before you even know that they were there. And so we've lost much more than that. In fact, we're probably in the vicinity of at least 1,000, if not 10,000 times the extinction rate that normally happens between what we call mass extinction events. And of course, the most infamous mass extinction event was the end of the Cretaceous about 66 million years ago, when great asteroid came and smacked into what is now the Gulf of Mexico and wiped out at least the non-avian dinosaurs, because we still have dinosaurs, of course. We just call them chickens now, and birds. But yeah, so massive extinction event, probably lost about 75% of all life on Earth. That bounced back. It took many millions of years to do so. But the extinction, the average extinction rate that's between these mass extinction events, we're now exceeding that by, as I said, 1,000 to 10,000 times, meaning that we're actually starting a mass extinction event now. Mass extinctions are defined by at least 3/4 of the species going extinct over 2 to 3 million years. Now, we haven't seen the end of this particular extinction event, but there's no question that we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event now, and it's because of us. Now, one pretty scary statistic that I pull out in pretty much all of my talks is the fact that, yes, we've lost lots of species, but more importantly, we're losing populations. And populations are collections of individuals from any one species. As those populations get smaller, they become more and more susceptible to what we call stochastic shocks. So that's just shocks to the system. So a big population yeah, you might get a volcanic eruption over here and it might destroy that island with all these little birds on it, but they're distributed throughout a whole bunch of islands in an archipelago. So the species is okay. But when the populations get very, very small, they become very susceptible to these, what would otherwise be unimportant shocks. And we've lost, since the 1970s, about 68% of all individuals of all vertebrate species. Now that's mind-blowing, meaning that we're pretty much driving all of these species to very small numbers, these populations that are the precursors to extinction. The biomass of wild mammals is probably only a quarter of what it was at the end of the Pleistocene, which is going back really to the time when humans started coming out of Africa and colonizing the planet. Our freshwater systems are incredibly damaged. We have probably less than 15% of our wetland area globally than we had even a couple hundred years ago. 3/4 of our rivers no longer meet their terminus because of blockages like dams or just total irrigation. We've lost kelp forests, about 40% of that globally. And even the biomass of fish in the seas is probably a third of what it was last century. We could go on and on and on here, but pretty much any metric you choose to look at on any taxon, any species group, any ecosystem is massively degraded. And we've kind of summarized that in an easy to sort of a glance, at glance figure that people can have a look at when they read the paper. Paper is free to read, by the way, so there's no charge. And that was another reason we published it where we did. So yeah, that's the background.
Yeah, and I think just for our listeners, we do talk about this, but reinforcement is good. But when we talk about the importance of wetlands and kelp forests and so on, we're talking about sequestration of carbon. We're talking about production of oxygen to some degree with what lives in our oceans, and that's quite a hot topic at the moment with the recent release of Seaspiracy on Netflix. But yeah, why is wild animals important? It's part of our balance of keeping the planet operating or functioning the way it should. So that's hugely, hugely important. When we talk about, you've touched on it in terms of biomass, but when we talk about ecological overshoot, we've recently been talking about Overshoot Day or World Overshoot Day, and we published, I think, a few weeks ago, Australia's Overshoot Day. If the world lived like Australians, we'd be taking 4.5 Earths to do so, and New Zealand, we're not that much better. We're I think a month away from our supposed Overshoot Day, but our rate of consumption, it's twofold, isn't it? It's population size that continues to grow, but it's our ability and our rate of consumption that is where a big problem is. And that ties back again to your comment around, I guess, politics and they're representing our interests and changing. It's all about popularity. It's a convoluted problem but our consumption is a big issue, and we've had a guest recently, and even some of our renewable energy solutions are not helping that either.
Yeah, and these are really good points. Coming to the overall consumption aspect, and yes, people like to argue, oh no, it's not population, oh no, it's just all consumption, or no, it's all population. Consumption can be controlled. Well, consumption and population are so intrinsically linked. It's like arguing whether the length of the width of a rectangle contributes more to the area. They're so importantly intertwined that you can't separate them. So we have to deal with both. And the overshoot issue is another thing that sort of confuses people. And I think a couple of good analogies there. And it's true, if you look at historically human populations, we've never lived longer. Child mortality has never been lower. Our general way of life has never been better. But as I said, we're kind of living on borrowed time in the idea that our consumption is outpacing our replacement. So that's really what the overshoot is talking about. And a good analogy is okay, yes, you have money in the bank. You're living well. You can afford your rent. You can afford to eat well. You can go to restaurants. You can travel. But every year you say you put $10,000 in that bank account, and then every year you take out 20,000. Now you can live well for a certain period of time, but at some point you're going to go bankrupt, and then the shit hits the fan. That's kind of the global equivalent of the overshoot. We're very much living on borrowed time. We're taking more from the planet than the planet can possibly replace, and that's everything from food to minerals to even the capacity for the planet to bounce back from planetary shocks. And climate change is one of those. So we're pumping all these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and when something like a bushfire happens, it's 10 times worse than it would be otherwise. So this is this idea that we're eroding resilience, and because there are more people and more consumers and fewer resources, eventually that's going to hit really, really hard, and we're going to go for a crash. And that's the kind of thing we talked about. Exiting this kind of overshoot dynamic is going to be by design or by disaster. Either way, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I like the quote that you use in the paper: humanity is running an ecological Ponzi scheme in which society robs nature and future generations to pay for boosting incomes in the short term. I think that sums it up pretty perfectly.
Yeah.
So given the magnitude of the environmental crises that you've outlined here, you would think that the political will and the policies that are being implemented would at least somewhat match the threats, but we're obviously not seeing that. And you've already kind of unpacked a little bit as to the reasons why there with the right-wing populist movement, etc. What can we do here? What can, the N of one, the individuals listening, kind of, what can we do to help shift that dial? How do we get more political action? Do we all need to go out and join Extinction Rebellion, or should we be writing to our members of parliament? What do we do?
Yeah, well, as anyone who has read this paper and is interested in exactly that question will probably be disappointed, because we have a single paragraph in there talking about how we improve things. That was by design, because we couldn't necessarily get to the complexity of all the things that society and individuals can do. I have the happy news, though, in this doomy and gloomy interview, to tell you that we're working on a follow-up to the paper right now. We have over 50 authors from every possible discipline you can imagine, from nuclear disarmament through to energy provision, through to education and everything in between, looking at how the sort of the lowest hanging fruit, the major societal shifts that can and need to happen, but also respecting those linkages that we talked about earlier. And so that's being written at the very moment, and we should have a follow-up within the next few months. So I imagine you might want me back to talk about that at some point. But so coming back to what one can do, yes, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think one of the biggest impediments to making good long-term decisions for the benefit of both society and the planet at large is decoupling the economic interests of the few from those of the many at the political stage. And that really comes down to political donations. We have proposed things like ICACs. That's a very common term in Australia, and just that's an independent commission for the avoidance of corruption. That's the general term. There's all the sort of variants there. We have state-based ones in Australia. We still don't have a federal one. The problem is that that's just the overt corruption. We're talking about people doing dodgy deals behind closed doors, whereas we have completely legal corruption in almost every single country on the planet, and that is political donations. And if you have the means and you can afford to be a lobbyist and you can park your bum in Canberra or in Wellington and promote your particular economic interests from an industry perspective and essentially buy the time of a politician, then you are pushing policy towards quick economic gain for your particular industry that then robs the capacity of a politician to make sound decisions for the electorate for whom she or he is actually responsible. So the number one thing we as voters can do is demand not just the capping, not just the transparency, but the actual abolition of political donations and the whole process that has become somewhat so run-of-the-mill and ordinary. People don't even question it anymore. In fact, in countries like the US, it's you can't survive without millions and millions of dollars in donations from your lobbyist groups. You just don't. You cease to be able to exist. Now, it was going to take a very brave political party or politician to put their foot down and say, we need to do this, but the people need to demand this. That's probably globally one of the biggest movements, not just from an environmental perspective, but from plutocracy, which is economic-driven policy, to democracy, which is people-driven policy. We don't have that anywhere on any planet. Some places do it better than others. Finland tends to do it a little bit better than most people. And we're somewhere in between in New Zealand and Australia. I'd say New Zealand's doing much better in that regard at the moment. But that's probably the big one. Now, there's a lot of other things. I do tread dangerous political waters by suggesting people really need to think about their reproductive life and embrace the trends that are happening around the world. A lot of women are choosing not to reproduce, and the societal pressure to do so is still very large, despite the fact that even though equality has improved markedly in the last few decades, there's still a lot of pressure on women, even in societies as so-called advanced as Australia and New Zealand, to have a family. Now, that's not a necessary thing for people to do, and to think about what they contribute. Some work that's been done recently in the last 4 years showing the greatest effects that an individual can have on reducing their output, their consumption, and their total footprint. Now, they've compared everything from driving electric cars to recycling to not doing overseas trips. Amongst, I think, about 15 different highly developed or high-income countries. And the number one thing that reduced an individual's footprint was having one fewer children in the family by an order of magnitude or more. So it's a really important thing to talk about. It gets very emotional when you throw human rights and religion and political ideologies into the mix, but it's something we need to talk about. Economic growth is probably another one that the average person can do a lot in terms of pressuring their political representatives to do something about. We're tied into this idea of, we listen to the unemployment figures or the GDP growth percentage, and, people sort of wring their hands and furrow their brows when, our economic growth has declined. We're actually in recession. Well, on a global scale, that's a good thing because if we continue to try to grow permanently in a finite system, that crash will come much, much faster. We need to be able to have more of a circular economy, and there are a lot of very clever economists that have designed systems that could very much work like that. We need to, what the economists say is discount our wealth for the damage that we're doing and the long-term uncertainty associated with the supply of goods based on the fact that at some point they're going to cease. The Suez Canal blockage is a really, really good example of that. That's very topical. One boat gets stuck in one canal on one part of the planet, and basically our economic system just shut itself overnight. Now, that supply chain, this global trade, has to start thinking about long-term resilience too. I mean, that was a tiny shock. Imagine if all of these, warfare gets involved and we have, intensifying cyclones and bushfires and pandemics, funny enough, that disrupt economic activity to the point where we're no longer able to live in this global trade planet that is focused on growth. We have to live closer to home. And if that means a dwindling sort of standard of living in terms of, I can't flit off to Paris for the weekend or, enjoy caviar or get my mangoes from Mexico in the middle of the winter, well, so be it. But I think we need to have a little bit more of a local focus. And, the the locavore movement is certainly part of that. And I'll touch on this because of your particular interest, but it's also a big one. We need to have a drastic reduction in meat consumption across the planet, and that is a huge benefit. It's not going to solve all of our problems. It's one tool in the toolbox, but massively reducing our dependence on meat consumption is a huge benefit.
And I think one of the big challenges as well with all these phenomenal points that you make here is that, unfortunately, we're a society that expects results tomorrow. You know, we've lost this ability to look ahead or make short-term sacrifices for that long-term gain. And the big challenge here is that despite, let's say overnight we took all yours and all the other leaders' fantastic points and advice and made that change overnight, there's still that lag, there's still that delay between that ecological deterioration and the penalties of the socioeconomic penalties. And that's our biggest challenge, because we can stop right now. Fossil fuels, let's stop right now. Let's stop eating meat. Let's stop, let's reduce the amount of kids we're having. But there's still the catch-up game in terms of the negative impact. So that's a big challenge to overcome.
Yeah, well, even climate change, that's a good example. If you did a virtual planetary genocide and experimentally removed all human beings from the planet overnight, you would still have several centuries, if not 1,000 years worth of latent climate change happening just from what we've already pumped into the atmosphere. We know from a biological perspective that the damages that we did a century ago tend to show up in terms of extinctions today. So there will be what we call committed extinctions for the next few centuries, even if everything went back to the good times in terms of fewer people making fewer dents in the planet. So yes, you're right. Even if we implemented, and that's the other component, is that even if you were to do this pie in the sky fantasy change to the way life operates on this planet now, the way society works, it still wouldn't be enough. And that's another realization I think is important that we tried to bring out in the paper, is that people are going to have to adapt as opposed to avoid. Scientists in my discipline and many others are not talking about avoiding problems. We're talking about dealing with it, and we're talking about strategies to deal with the mess, because a mess is happening and it's going to get worse irrespective of what we do. So we changed our philosophy. Before, even 10 years ago, we were talking about we need to avoid 1 degree Celsius warming. We need to avoid pandemics. We failed there. We need to avoid this, that, and the other thing. We're not talking about that at all anymore. We've pretty much said, okay, the future is going to be ghastly. What gets me up in the morning and out of bed is saying, well, if I can make the future just a little bit less shitty for my daughter, then I've justified my existence. And that's really what we're talking about, making the world just a little less ghastly in the future than it would otherwise be.
And just on that point, I would highly recommend anyone listening go to your blog and read your poem, My Daughter's Earth. I think that sums everything up beautifully.
Yeah. Well, yes, that was written in a particular fit of desperation and rage about the lack of progress. And yes, I use expletives liberally throughout, but that was kind of the point. So if you're not offended by strong language, please do read that.
Well, a quote that I like to, it won't be word for word because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but a quote I do like to refer to in a lot of my presentations now is that, and it's from a Native American proverb, is that we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children, we borrow it from the future. And I think that's a big mindset shift that we need to take. Professor Bradshaw, it's been an absolute treat and privilege to have you on the show, because you're someone that tells it how it is. And that's important, because it's very easy to be aligned to a particular group, a particular way of thinking, just to appease, a particular community or society. And we're not insinuating that that's what anyone else has done, But in your particular case, you're really putting it out there, and it's a reality check, and we need that. And at the same time, let's not have false expectations. We've got to be prepared to take it head on. But what can we do to minimize that impact, and what can we do to reduce that impact? And I think that's the powerful message you are delivering here. And we're certainly looking forward to the follow-up paper. Because that's we are a bit of a solutions-based entity as well. But lastly, like you say, lack of connectivity has been part of the problem. Some of our listeners are scientists, engineers, people that can drive solution and to create a community of solution-based people. I think that's the way forward. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate the work you do in general. And we look forward to keeping in touch in the future.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that and the ability to wax lyrical on. And usually interviews are very short and they don't allow you to get into the guts. And I do appreciate that opportunity. So thank you both.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.